Thank you. Thank you, Jeff Holtz, and thank you, everyone. You hear me okay? Yeah. When I met Jeff, somewhere in the first week or so, I noticed he had a old Chrysler. It was reminiscent of the battleship North Carolina. And it had an impeach Nixon sticker holding it together. And that's pretty much all I remember from early on. But we've always had a political interest that we shared too, and as well as history and a lot of fun. So thank you, Jeff, for that very personal introduction. It is a treat to be with you for this inaugural Kirk Keller lecture, and it was very nice meeting Kirk's parents and the whole family. And I'll share this anecdote that Mr. Keller remembers now that when, before Kirk was born, but he was being carried by his mother. They were visiting family. Was it your brother, Mr. Keller? Uncle up in D.C. area. And so they went by water to Mount Vernon, to visit Mount Vernon. So Kirk Keller went to Mount Vernon before he came out of the womb. And I think George Washington would really appreciate that. In fact, I've written a lot about George Washington's travels, but I don't know where all he went in the womb. So, but I think this is a good aspect right here. So I'm glad you shared that, but I think that's a sweet little connection that we have tonight. Well, on this very day in 1791, April the 15th, there was no income tax back in 1791. President Washington was on his southern tour, which I will describe more fully as we go along, but I want to read to you from his diary entry for April the 15th, 1791. He was departing from Petersburg, Virginia that morning and traveling to what today is Emporia, Virginia. It was then called Hicks's Ford, fording over the river. Washington wrote, "Having suffered very much by the dust yesterday and finding that parties of horse and a number of other gentlemen were intending to attend me part of the way today, I caused their inquiries respecting the time of my setting out to be answered that I should endeavor to do so before 8 o'clock. But I did it a little after 5 a.m., by which means I avoided the inconveniences above mentioned." George Washington lying right on April the 15th, like so many do. It's an American tradition. President Washington did fib. And this was a real problem he had when he traveled like this. He had so many admiring people that would follow him. The local militia, the local officials, just people in general. They would stir up terrible dust when it was a dusty time, and it was a practical problem for Washington. He would mention it from time to time in his diary, and so he had misled them, saying, well, I'll probably leave around 8 o'clock, and indeed he got out of town early to beat those inconveniences of that dust. So that was George Washington on this very day in 1791. Of the early presidents, only George Washington really got to know the South and North Carolina. John Adams never went south of Northern Virginia. Thomas Jefferson, the Virginian, and I'm affronted by this, never came to North Carolina. James Madison, I don't think he ever came to North Carolina. We have no real evidence, but some in his family say that he may have visited present-day Person County, visiting some of Dolly, his wife's family, up there near Roxborough. But we don't know for sure about that, but that's not much of a sampling in North Carolina. Either way, James Madison, as president, certainly didn't really come to North Carolina. James Monroe did visit a few coastal places. He came by water to Edenton, Newbern, and Wilmington, I believe it was, but he didn't really get to know the state. John Quincy Adams never came to North Carolina. Not until Andrew Jackson became president in 1829 was there a U.S. president after Washington who had a real feel for North Carolina and the South. And of course, Andrew Jackson was all over the Carolinas and all over the South, so he really was representative. But I think that's another important point about studying George Washington's visit to the South. What was George Washington doing anyway? Why was he coming here? George Washington was salesman-in-chief, y'all. Yeah, he was selling the new U.S. government, the new U.S. Constitution. I don't have to probably remind you that, I mean, you know, there's great debates about our government and controversies over the Constitution right to this minute. So you can bet in 1790, 1791, a lot of people were not too sure about this government and this Constitution, George Washington was greatly respected, widely revered. He was hailed as a hero. He was the hero of the American Revolution. George Washington realized that he had clout, and he was a shrewd man. So he was selling. He wanted to promote this government and the Constitution because he knew that he carried sway. And he was not foolish about that. And he was 6'2", 6'3". That also helped carry some sway. And so Washington knew it was good to be seen and to be promoting what he cared about. He was behind the Constitution. He wanted to sell it. He wanted to unite the country. Hence, he actually visited all 13 states in less than 2.5 years. He did this primarily through 3 trips, and the last one was the Southern Tour, which occurred in the spring of 1791. Washington also just liked to get out of the office. He was not an office kind of guy. He was a farmer. He was a soldier. He liked to be out. He was a surveyor. And so, also, Washington had been terribly ill in the spring of 1790, near death, pneumonia, other things. And it was thought then it would be healthy to restore your health, to get out on horseback, to breathe the air out of doors. And Washington was well by the spring of 1791, so this trip was partly to restore his health. So for the spring of 1791, Washington, a detail guy, he was as a general, he was as a president. He got into the details. He got into the weeds sometimes. I'm sure he drove his staff crazy. I know he did in the Revolution. Many officers would kind of throw up their hands about Washington getting so involved in things, even the way the camp was laid out, the way the buildings were constructed, and so forth. But it was a blessing for Washington, and maybe a curse too. But Washington would plan this trip. He would work with his secretaries. He would consult with gentlemen of the South who he knew through Congress, but a lot of them he knew during the Revolution, and he would find out about the roads to take, the roads to avoid, where to cross water, what was the easiest way to go, who to see, who not to see, that sort of thing. However, the primary place that Washington wanted to visit on the Southern tour was Charleston, South Carolina. Charleston was the 4th largest city in the country in the 1790 census, behind only Boston, Philadelphia, and New York. And so Washington had to get to Charleston, plus he had a lot of friends there, and that was just a prominent place, a place of influence and affluence, and Washington intended to get to Charleston. Otherwise, he wanted a representative journey through the southern states. And the southern states then, I remind you, were Virginia, North and South Carolina, and Georgia. That was it in 1791. There was no Kentucky, Tennessee, Alabama, Mississippi, and certainly no Florida. That was not anywhere he was going. And so it was a long enough trip as it was. The capital was still in Philadelphia, and he would travel from Philadelphia down to Georgia. Washington was a wealthy man. He received a presidential salary of $25,000. That was a whopping sum in that era. However, he covered most of his own expenses, and he did on this trip. But he had his own carriage that he would provide for this journey, and having a carriage as fine as his, an enclosed carriage with great springs, shock absorbers, if you will, an odometer, and it had the finest finishings on it, art on the doors, on the door panels, and so forth. This was rare, very rare in this country, and I would say it was really, and this is true, very much like any of us owning a small private jet today. Not many people had a carriage of this kind. George Washington did. He would provide it for his own use. He would provide the horses. He would provide the staff. And he provided the baggage wagon as well that went along on this journey. It was going to be George Washington, a carriage, a baggage wagon, and a total, both pulled by 4 horses, and a few other horses along for the ride or to be ridden. And these horses were to be led along during the day, and occasionally people would mount their backs. There was one in particular that was often led along until President Washington would mount his back, and that was one of the tallest horses in the country, a big white steed named Prescott. Washington's horse Prescott went along for the journey. On the edge of town oftentimes, George Washington, a man of theater, knowing that it was important to look presidential, something that may be lost now in the 21st century. So looking presidential to George Washington was mounting the back of Prescott and riding high in the saddle, literally into the communities, looking like a leader. George Washington stood out in every which way. So it was 9 men, 2 of them were slaves, the others were on Washington's staff that he afforded at his executive residence in Philadelphia. One of them, a secretary, was Major William Jackson. That's his title from the Revolution. You know how people like to cling to their military titles. And so Major Jackson, a Charlestonian, South Carolinian all his life, was the secretary on all of these tours through the states. He was perfect for it. He was a smart guy. He was in his early 30s, so he was healthy and young, and he was single. So he was the perfect one to escort President Washington on these journeys. And this would be a particularly long journey, 3.5 months they'd be away from Philadelphia. They would leave on March the 21st and not get back to Philly until July the 6th. Washington, in these details, figured out his route. He decided he would come down the fall line and coastal plains of the South, all the way to Savannah, then cut up to Augusta, play a little golf at Augusta National, like any president, and then turn north and come back through the Piedmont of the Carolinas and Virginia. Along the way, he even stopped in the future Washington, D.C. More on that. Washington kept a diary, a daily diary of this journey. That's my primary source. This is a version that has wonderful footnotes in it that helps this author very much, put out by the University of Virginia. But it's a great resource. He writes pretty dryly. He doesn't tell you a whole lot about conversations. He'll tell you who he saw, but he doesn't really tell you what they said or much about what they talked about. But he was a keen observer. He talks about the soil. He's a farmer. He talks about how the rivers are flowing and if they could be deeper and if the commerce could be improved, if they would dredge the channel. He talks about the crops that are being grown. He talks about the kinds of trees he sees and speculates as to the quality of the soil based on the tree types he sees, because Washington knows these kinds of things. He offers opinions on things. But he's also very encouraging about people. He says, I think these people will do well. They're industrious and so forth. But he speaks in a lot of generalities. But he doesn't tell you a lot about the meetings that went on. Well, let's talk a little bit about who George Washington was as a guy. Not to diminish him, but to actually just make him sort of fun, a little bit fun. Because how many think of George Washington ever as being fun? No one, of course, that is right. I'll try to help on that. George Washington loved to play cards of all sorts. He loved the theater, very much so. He even had plays put on for his troops at Valley Forge. He liked Madeira wine and imported it regularly. And he was a great dancer, light on his feet, even though he had size 13 boots. He liked horse racing very much and fox hunting, and he was sometimes bet on the horses. He loved foxhounds. He loved dogs of all kinds, and in fact, he is considered the father of the American foxhound. He believed in walking and exercising and taking in nature. He was a land speculator and a shrewd businessman. He was a shrewd farmer. He believed in crop rotation and was ahead of most Virginians on farming and agricultural practices. He created a 16-sided barn, essentially a round barn, that allowed horses and mules to do a threshing process, running in a circle. He was a strong military leader. He made many, many mistakes in his career, but he learned from them. He didn't usually make the same mistake twice. He was a very good father, or stepfather, I mean to say, and step-grandfather to Martha's children. He had a very good marriage to Martha Custis Washington, the widow, the wealthiest woman in Virginia, maybe in the States. And again, George Washington was shrewd. He probably knew about that little detail. But George Washington also, I think, felt very close to Martha early on, as she did to him, and I believe they grew to love one another very, very much. They were very loyal to one another. George Washington was charitable and philanthropic. two colleges, Washington College and Washington Lee, Washington College in Maryland, Washington Lee in Virginia, are his namesakes because of charitable significant gifts that he made in the 1700s to them. He often helped travelers and neighbors at Mount Vernon. He funded schools in Alexandria and in Philadelphia. George Washington was a strong man physically and emotionally, and he was able to lead, and he was able to gain the advice from other strong people and take the best advice from them. He could put Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton in the same room. They did not like one another at all, but he could figure out the best from them and take the best from them. Washington had a terrible temper all of his life. It got better. He liked to control things, and it made him mad that he couldn't control his own temper. That was George Washington, but he did improve. He improved at almost everything he wanted to do. He lost his father at age 11, and he had a difficult relationship with his mother. Not an outwardly difficult relationship, but it just was not a warm and fuzzy sort of thing, but he always provided for her and did the best by her that he could. His only trip outside this country was to Barbados. George Washington, father of the spring break. But George throws me there because he actually went in the fall. He went in the fall and the winter, but George Washington did go with his half-brother Lawrence to Barbados when he was a 19-year-old and spent several months there. And that's where he actually first fell in love with the theater. He was exposed to a lot of different things on that journey, which was a sailing trip, of course. And in addition to the voyage itself, he just had a very much educational experience in Barbados. While on that trip, he contracted smallpox. He contracted smallpox. Obviously, he survived and became immune to that terrible pox, which ravaged his army at times during the Revolution. It was fortuitous that George Washington, its leader, was immune to the pox. Washington was progressive. He tried to get his troops, when possible, vaccinated for smallpox. Washington, who's not really a wordsmith, but is credited with a few words in the Oxford English Dictionary: presidential administration, he created it; ravine, which comes from his exploits as a surveyor and landowner; towpath. George Washington, the entrepreneur and the transpo guy, believed in canals, and somehow he gets credited with towpath by putting those oxen, horses, and mules over there beside the river. So Washington does get some OED credit. He was a leader in every way imaginable. Even at the Constitutional Convention, he presided over it. He rarely said anything, but as the hero of the Revolution, he was its chairman. And he sat there, and people cared what he thought. They would talk to him after discussions privately. He was the leader. He liked to be under control. He even called his own death. George Washington lived his entire life in the 18th century. Born in 1732, he died in mid-December of 1799, as if his time was up. It was a 18th century kind of thing. You have done wonders. No need to go any further. Because he was doing okay. He was at Mount Vernon, been retired a couple of years. Things were going well. And he contracted this sudden throat infection. Within 72 hours, he was gone. He was dying. But in his last hours, he was in his bedchamber, which you can visit today at Mount Vernon, and he pulled Tobias Lear, one of his secretaries, still had that shrimp to do that, down to him and said, "Do not bury me shy of 3 days." Giving orders right to the end. George Washington did not want to be buried alive. Who does? They didn't bury him any sooner than 3 days either, by the way. I don't know how he got that throat infection or exactly what it was. There's a lot of different speculation there, but he probably didn't get it by shaking hands with anyone because he tended to like the bow and curtsy sort of thing. George Washington was a formal kind of a guy. Thomas Jefferson actually bought more expensive wine than George Washington, but Thomas Jefferson sort of had that arrogant, shabby thing going on, you know. Washington had the royal trappings thing kind of going on a little bit. He liked fine and fancy and formal things. And so, they didn't always agree that way. But so Washington wasn't much into shaking hands, or also he didn't like to be womped on the back. No womping on the back of George Washington. That was the George I like to talk about. What about the North Carolina that Washington would soon visit? What were we like in 1791? Well, we'd become the 12th state in 1789. North Carolina has always been reluctant to join anything. We didn't join the Union very readily. We didn't join the Confederacy very readily. We just kind of wanted to be left alone. But seriously, we were not a very unified state. We had a lot of barriers in traveling east to west. We had a lot of different interests. Religious groups had their own ways of seeing and doing. And so we did not have much unity here. But yet we were a large state in population, one of the largest states with 400,000 population in the 1790 census. The largest town, however, had fewer than 3,000 souls, and that was Newbern in 1790. I think the only newspaper being published at the exact time that Washington visited in 1791 in the state was in Newbern as well, the Athens of North Carolina, if you will. Most of the homes here were made of wood. They were not brick, they were not stone. We had some stone homes in the Piedmont, not many brick homes at all anywhere. And the chimneys were of sticks and mud as well, a real fire hazard. Corn was our chief crop. Naval stores for tar, pitch, and turpentine from the longleaf pines of eastern North Carolina, that was our chief industry. There was not a bank in the state in 1791. We didn't have a bank until 1804 when they opened up in Newbern and Wilmington. No ATMs either, by the way. I'm trying to compete with you, Jeff. Oh, cool. In 1791, we didn't want to spend money on fencing and so forth when you get along with your neighbors and this kind of thing. It was just an easy-going place, so we didn't have a lot of fences, so that meant that the livestock wandered freely, and people helped one another gather up the pigs and hogs and sheep and cattle. Also wandering freely were Presbyterians and Baptists, Methodists, Quakers and Moravians. This is one reason we have this lack of unity thing going on here. Had a lot of different religious groups with their way of seeing and doing. But these religious folks provided most of the schools. UNC had been chartered in 1789, but in 1791 a campus had not yet been selected. A capital city had been designated for Wake County in 1791, but the actual site had not yet been selected. We were a culturally diverse state representing many different interests. We were slow to accept the new U.S. Constitution, and in fact, we had to vote on it twice to accept it, and it wasn't unanimous the second time either. So this was the kind of place Washington was coming into. Also, one thing we did have in common with most of the rest of the country is we had very bad roads, few places to cross water comfortably, and very bad flea-bitten accommodations. So this is something that Washington would run into from time to time in his travels. Washington, as much as practical on these trips, did not want to accept private hospitality. In parts of the country, that was easier to stay in reasonably decent inns in the Middle Atlantic and New England states. But in the South, you could stay in some really bad lodging in 1791. And he did on some nights. But he did break his rules some, particularly in South Carolina when it was long stretches between places. He would wind up staying at plantation homes instead of worrying about trying to stay anywhere else. And his entourage, the 2 slaves and the staff, I think they slept in barns. I think they were also sometimes put up with lesser neighbors of the plantation owners. I think sometimes they had to work practically all night getting ready to leave the next day. I think the slaves may have slept in the baggage wagon some nights. Some of what I'm saying is speculation, but there were no great accommodations for the rest of the staff most of the time. There were some exceptions to that. So that's the way that they were rolling in 1791. When George Washington departed Philadelphia on the first day of spring, March the 21st, he was heading south. He was nearly 60 years old. He was 59. He would not bring Martha on this trip. This was considered too long, too grueling, too rough a trip for a lady. Not a proper thing for a lady to do. It would be all men. Washington was escorted out of Philadelphia that spring day by Thomas Jefferson and Henry Knox, 2 of his cabinet members. They went down the rutted streets They didn't know for sure where they were even going to stay the first night. And that's often the way this was. They wound up staying in Chester, Pennsylvania. But Washington did make some prearrangements and he had an itinerary that he was shooting for and generally was able to stick to it. But he didn't get on that rigid itinerary until later on in Virginia and the Carolinas and Georgia. And so some nights they didn't know where they were going, and others they had a general idea of where they were going to land. Washington would work his way to what he called the Federal City after a stop for several days in Annapolis, Maryland, which was a pretty nice place. He got on over to the Potomac and spent a couple nights in a little town called Georgetown, Maryland. Georgetown, Maryland. Many of you have gone to Georgetown, D.C. and spent a lot of money there in recent years. But back then it was still just Georgetown, Maryland. On this very trip, on this southern tour, George Washington solidified the exact site of the future Washington, D.C. He had already decided it would be on the Potomac, somewhere roughly between Alexandria and the Falls of the Potomac. But on this trip, he stopped coming and going, and he worked with Peter L'Enfant, the Frenchman from the Revolution, the general, and city planner, and he and L'Enfant and commissioners, which had been appointed by Washington, agreed on things. However, local landowners had a say in this, didn't they? They had an interest in this, and like any good American, they wanted to know what's in this deal for us. How's this going to work? And so I think Washington, and I really can't do justice to how the city was laid out and Washington's exact plan, but essentially it was, if you'll give us some of your land and sell us some of your land and keep some of your land, that land that you keep will be worth something because we're going to put this capital city here. And your land isn't really worth that much right now, so what's wrong with that? We're going to give you a little money, you give us some land, and then you keep holding some land. So it was like a third. And that was the general idea of how it worked out. And so they kind of got sold on that when Washington left Georgetown going south, but by the time he got back, they were up in arms again and thinking this wasn't going to work out. But George got them calmed down. So Washington stopped on the Potomac and spent several days there, felt pretty good as he left, and then he stopped at his home, Mount Vernon. And this was a real treat for Washington. Some of you may know that during the Revolution, he rarely got to Mount Vernon. I think it was 8 years one stretch without getting there at all. And so he only got there 12 times as president in his 8 years as president, and 2 of the times were on this southern tour as he was going south and returning north. He spent a week each time. Well, then he struck out, and then he really gets into the rhythm of the tour after he leaves Mount Vernon heading south in middle of April of 1791. And he was in Fredericksburg, and he was in Richmond. He saw that beautiful Capitol building, some of you may know there, that we see in the white stucco. He saw it in red brick. They eventually painted it, then they later stuccoed it. Oh, I think within a few years. But Washington saw it in red brick, and he never got back to Richmond. This was his last visit. And from Richmond, he worked his way down I-95, as we were talking about earlier, all that dust. And he got to North Carolina on April the 16th. His first stop after, yesterday's turbulent weather. It was probably a similar or worse day. It was a very stormy day, April the 16th, 1791, a long day. Nowhere to stop short of Halifax, North Carolina. They had to cross the river to get on over to the town proper. And once he got there, I don't know, he was all wet, you might say. He had to be received by Wiley Jones, spelled like Willie but pronounced Wiley. He was one of the leading citizens of the state at the time. Jones Street in Raleigh, site of the General Assembly, is named for Wiley Jones. Very prominent man. Wiley Jones was the leading opponent to the U.S. Constitution in North Carolina, and that was George Washington's first stop into Tar Heel State. Hello, President Washington. Well, Washington knew about Wiley Jones. He had been warned of him, and I don't have any insight as to even any of their interactions, but Jones had already put out the word. This was in someone's letter that quoted Jones, said, "I will receive Washington only as a great man, but not as President of the United States." So that's very telling, isn't it? And that gives you a sense of what it was like at that time. But George Washington knew his job was to bring people together, to win people over, so he's undaunted. He comes anyway. So after a couple of days in Halifax, you know, and the thing is, some people may have been a big fan of Washington there in Halifax, but Washington was staying 2 days. They had to live with Wiley Jones the rest of the time after Washington left, and so it probably tamped down the reception some there. From Halifax was off to Tarboro, where Washington, as I mentioned, was a bit of a formal man, like pomp and ceremony. He wrote in his diary that I got as good a salute as one can receive from a single cannon. In Greenville, Washington saw tar being made. In Newbern, Washington received his biggest and finest North Carolina reception. He spent 2 nights. You can see the home where he stayed there, the John Wright Stanley home. He danced at Tryon Palace, had a meal there, and at Tryon Palace there was a ball with, in Washington, a detail man would always write down how many lovely ladies were in attendance. There were 70 in Newbern. 70. I think Major Jackson, that secretary, had to help him count. I'm not sure. But his dance card, literally, there was someone that wrote that Washington danced the night away, but he had announced earlier that he'd be leaving by 11 o'clock that night to retire for the evening. Washington on this trip often left early in the morning, and so 5 a.m. was not uncommon, definitely 6:30, and later it would get even earlier. I'll try to touch on that. Between Newbern and Wilmington, Washington wrote in his diary that it's the most barren land I've ever beheld. We now call that Camp Lucerne. I guess that's the highest and best use. Washington, the farmer, could not really understand the lonely pine savannas he was seeing and didn't really quite understand the whole tar pitch and turpentine thing. He was beginning to learn about it, but he just thought it seemed like an underutilized place, and what else can you grow here other than these big pine trees? And so that was new to him, but he wrote it was rather pretty. It was rather pretty. In Wilmington, Washington was impressed with the river commerce, and there another fine ball with nearly 70 ladies. No scandal here, but he did stay in the widow Quince's house in Wilmington, but the widow stayed down the street, I think. Is that camera working? In Charleston, this was going to be a big deal. He had to work his way down the coast to get to Charleston because there were big things awaiting him there. He then went down through Brunswick County, and he went to what's now Myrtle Beach, but that was simply called Long Bay. There was almost no development along the coast of South Carolina at that time. This little entourage, that white carriage and the baggage wagon, and those mostly brown horses except for Prescott, went right down Long Bay, Myrtle Beach, 30-some miles at low tide, because that was the best road. That was better than staying inland and working your way down the King's Highway proper. And so I just always, in my mind, just think that would be wonderful to get to see that. Washington wrote about how lovely it was. There were guides, characters, I think, that lived usually at the inlets above what are now beaches that would take money from travelers to show them how to cross at low tide and to get across the inlets and then to get on the beaches and go down. And so they must have paid off a character or two to make that trip. And they stopped in Georgetown, South Carolina, and later Hampton Plantation. And Washington, the farmer, was very impressed about rice and indigo cultivation in those communities. Well, Charleston stayed a week. And this is when I think the entire staff got to stay in the home down there, where you can still visit on Church Street, where they spent the week. Hayward Washington House, it's called today, on Church Street. A very fine home. It was the city home of a Mr. Hayward who had a plantation out of town. And they stayed there, and they even had a staff that the city of Charleston paid for. And that was a very special and restful time, I think, for everyone, because the staff didn't have to worry about getting up and traveling the next day, or only a 2-night break. They instead had a whole week to rest up, take care of things, and so forth. It was a very special time for them all. And this whole thing culminated the last night there in the Exchange Building, which stands at the foot of Broad Street, still there. You can visit it, with a ball that had, according to Washington, over 400 of the loveliest ladies I have ever beheld. A lot better than that lonely pine forest back in North Carolina. Well, from Charleston, it was down to Savannah, spent a couple of nights there, and coming and going on the Savannah River, he went to Mulberry Grove Plantation to visit the Widow Green. Another widow coming up here, the Widow Green. This was Nathaniel Green's wife. He had died of sunstroke a few years earlier, She was still there on the plantation. A year or two after this, Eli Whitney, the Yankee from Connecticut, would be at Mulberry Grove and supposedly invent the cotton gin. But Washington was there a couple of years ahead of that, and he was simply paying his respects to one of his favorite general's widows. I can't even remember her first name now. I'm always trying to find a picture of the girl, but I can't. No one seemed to carry a phone with them on that whole trip. Well, it was time to go uphill a little bit for the first time in a while. Washington was work his way up to the Piedmont of Georgia to Augusta, which was the capital of Georgia at the time. He would be met by the governor there. He would spend a couple of days in Augusta, and then he would turn north. He would turn north, and something happened. I mentioned he was leaving early at 5 and 6 and 6:30. He started leaving at 4 a.m. a lot of times as he was going north, because at this point in late May of 1791, he had actually visited the entire southern states. He had visited all 13 states, so he still wanted to be respectful and make this journey, but he was heading home now. It was time to get rolling, and he started trying as much as possible to just stay one night, and he would start leaving at 4 and 4:30 in the morning. Must have been tough keeping up with President Washington. So from Augusta, it was up to Columbia, but he did have to stay 2 nights in Columbia. That was a new capital city. The Capitol building had just been there a couple of years. Not much going on there. He would have never stayed 2 nights, but a horse went a little lame, and he had to give it some rest. The horses worried him. He wrote about the horses all the time. This was his transportation. He loved horses. He was one of the finest horsemen in America. He understood horses, but he had to rely on them too. So he studied them very closely to see how they were doing. And so they had to rest up both a night extra in Columbia and a night extra in Camden, their next stop, before continuing north. In Camden, Washington did something that he had done at several locations. He enjoyed seeing the sites of the American Revolution, the battle sites, and he had only known them before in reports, and now he got to see them firsthand. From Camden, it was through the upstate of South Carolina, up near present-day Rock Hill, where he met with some Catawba Indian leaders. How many of you have heard about the Catawba Indians are seeking a casino over south of Charlotte? A few folks know about that. I think that's what they discussed that night back in 1790. It's been a slow thing for them getting this casino. I'm not sure what all was said. There's no actual minutes, but their concern was real. They had land that was granted by the colonial government of South Carolina and the article under the Articles of Confederation earlier to a reservation, essentially in that Rock Hill Fort Mill area, and this was a Catawba Indian reservation. But now we were the United States, and now South Carolina was, at least then, a United State. It wouldn't be later, and so who had jurisdiction over this? But their concern was they felt like settlers were coming in and pushing them out of their reservation. And they were right. They were. And that continued right on into the 20th century. And today it's just really a small band of Catawba Indians that still can reside there. They're kind of a loose-knit tribe. But Washington kicked that can down the road. It was just a tough issue. He said, I think you need to talk to Congress and to the South Carolina legislature. I got to head to Charlotte, thank you. And so it was on to Charlotte. George Washington did spend 1 night in Charlotte, and he did something that has impacted North Carolina ever since, and I guess South Carolina too for that matter. Washington wrote that Charlotte is but a trifling place, and they've been trying to prove him wrong ever since. Where Washington slept was at the corner of Church and Trade Street at Cook's Inn, and that's now Hooters, in case you're interested. This is true. That is right. No archaeological digs have gone on there, but that's kind of sad sometimes when you realize these things. Not too many of the sites where Washington slept on this journey exist. He stopped at a lot of other places that exist, but not too many where he slept, and that one is a Hooters in another restaurant called the King's Arm or something like that is on that site. From Charlotte, it was on what's now the I-85 corridor off to Concord, Salisbury. In Salisbury, he was greeted there with a parade. And that afternoon, he had a tea with just 20 ladies. Just 20 ladies. He didn't mention how they looked either, so I'm not sure. He was getting tired by then as well. That evening before he retired, some of the citizens were out on the street clamoring for him to give us a word, share something with us. And this is probably very literally true, and this was documented in a diary. He says, "You see before you only an old, tired, gray man." He was just being truthful at that point. But he actually enjoyed the kind of sweet and humble reception in Salisbury over some of the gaudier ones he would have had in, say, Savannah and Charleston and so forth. He thought it was his kind of place, a backcountry place. From Salisbury, next stop, Salem, the Moravian village. It was not called Old Salem yet, just simply Salem. He stayed 2 nights there, but he only wanted to stay 1. This pattern keeps happening. But it wasn't a horse problem this time. It was the governor of North Carolina that was a problem. Governor Alexander Martin had sent word on the day that Washington arrived. He was very sorry. He would be a day late in arriving. I'm sure Washington was not real pleased with that. But he said, okay, I'll stick around here for 2 nights. But I think he very much enjoyed the hospitality of the Moravians. They were known for their food and their desserts and their music, and they're very cordial people. He toured everything very much in detail there, including the waterworks, which he thought were amazing because they had a way of, from a spring, a creek, actually bringing water to a central distribution point in the village. And so I think Washington enjoyed his stay there very much. On the second night, he was being serenaded by song and harpsichord. And at the end of the evening, this is in the Moravian diary, don't have the exact detail, but he gave the harpsichord player a home remedy as to how to cure that wart on her hand. That's pretty special. But unfortunately, they didn't document what the remedy was. So we don't know. And I don't know if she ever got rid of that wart or not. From Salem off to Guilford Courthouse, this is pre-Greensboro. Greensboro, a namesake of Nathaniel Greene that we mentioned, the widow Greene earlier. Greensboro didn't quite yet exist. It was Guilford Courthouse, the county seat of Guilford County. But there, 10 years, almost exactly 10 years earlier, a notable battle had been fought in the Revolution. Washington very much enjoyed seeing this site because his favorite general, General Greene, was in charge that day. And Washington also was there because Governor Alexander Martin, who did come over to meet him in Salem, also had a home there. So that's where he stayed that night at Guilford Courthouse. By the way, I always have this little joke. At Guilford Courthouse, the North Carolina militia was supposed to fire 2 shots in front of the regular Continental Army at the Redcoats before retreating, but it is recorded that many of them didn't fire a single shot and were retreating immediately. And so that's really where our license plate slogan, "First in Flight," comes from. Because Ohio is challenging us some on that other thing, so maybe we should just stick with that. From Guilford Courthouse, Washington entered Virginia at what is now Danville, Virginia. His last night in North Carolina was north of Yanceyville, and he stayed at Dudley Gatewood's home. Mr. Gatewood was a prominent local man. His descendant, Maud Gatewood, if you've heard that name, became a prominent artist. I'm not sure if she still lives. She may, but she's been prominent in recent years. And the Gatewoods were a well-known family, maybe right up until the day there, just south of Danville, Virginia, but in North Carolina. And I knew he stayed at Dudley Gatewoods, and I assumed the home was long, long gone. But just a few years ago, I learned that in the 1970s, that home, which was quite decrepit, where Washington had spent his last night in the state, was deconstructed, put on a flatbed truck, carried to Hillsboro, and reconstructed, and then added to and modified a little bit. I've seen it. It looks very nice, but it's not in the historic, charming Hillsboro area you might be thinking about. It's in Daniel Boone Village. It's a Mexican restaurant. Jorge Washington slept here. So and it does look very nice. And some of you been there, you know about it? Yeah, and go check it out. And inside they have a couple of pictures of the old home when it was in a decrepit state. Well, Washington worked his way from Southside Virginia back up to Fredericksburg, where he spent another night with his sister as he had coming and going. He stopped again at Mount Vernon. He stopped and got the local straight at the federal city and said, look, folks, if you don't want to work this out with the federal government to commit to putting the capital here, Philadelphia, will be happy to keep it. And Washington meant that. And they took that threat seriously, and they came together, and hence we have Washington, D.C. to this day. Washington stopped in Lancaster, Pennsylvania on July the 4th. He was really ready to get on back to Philly. He got there on July the 3rd, but they convinced him he had to stay all day on the 4th and another night. And I guess he was close enough to home that he agreed to do that. So he started a bit of a tradition there with the president celebrating with the public July the 4th. He did that in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and he got back to Philly on July the 6th. On the whole, Washington was pleased with this trip. Plus, he was done visiting the 13 states. He had traveled and survived nearly 1,900 miles. And I remind you, he had that odometer almost every day in the diary. He'd tell you how many miles he traveled, anywhere from about 25 to 40 most days. He felt good about the will of the people, about their attitude, their spirit, their industriousness, and the way they lived, and their contentment, and generally their acceptance of the new government and the Constitution. He wrote that he gained flesh while his horses lost flesh. During the trip, he traveled from elevations ranging from sea level to over 1,100 feet in the northern Piedmont of North Carolina, kind of that Winston-Salem, Reidsville area before getting up to Danville. He met with 5 governors and visited 4 state capitals in North Carolina. He couldn't visit our state capital because we didn't really have one. It was in Fayetteville at the time. It was still moving around from Hillsborough, Halifax, Newbern, Fayetteville, and it was in Fayetteville at that time. He did meet our governor, however. He drank hundreds of toasts and danced with dozens of ladies. Legend has it that he left his powder box in Charlotte, but that's not gunpowder. That is hair and body powder, but likely hair powder to give you that sheen that you want. Washington did not wear a wig, but he did like to powder his hair. I've been back to that Hooters, I don't know how many times, looking for that powder box. No luck. In Windy Hill Beach, South Carolina, they claim they take their name because Washington's hat kept blowing off as he traversed their dunes. In Hampstead, North Carolina, and this definitely is not true, but it's cute, they say that they take their name because Washington ordered ham instead of oysters during his brunch stop there. And he did stop there. There's a big tree, Hampstead, right by US 17, where Washington stopped and took a break and had a meal. In 3.5 months of travel, he slept in about 60 different places, but only about 6 to 8, kind of depending on how you look at it, still stand, and that includes Salem Tavern in Old Salem and Mount Vernon itself. George Washington was the unifying figure of early America, and the Southern tour, a deliberate and successful effort to see and be seen and to unite Americans, was an important effort in pulling us together into one. I'll close with a variation of a toast that Washington used often in the evenings throughout this trip. To the citizens of Wayne County, prosperity to the residents. Thank you very much. Thank you.